Tuesday, March 27th, the morning work session of the Portland City Council. Today we're going to start off with the revenue special topic, which sounds very, very exciting. We have Jennifer Cooperman here today to kick us off. Good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning. Green is on, right?
Yes.
Great.
Green is on.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting us. I'm Jennifer Cooperman, Chief Financial Officer for the City of Portland and Director of the Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services. We are here to talk about to have a discussion regarding the enterprise-wide goal of stable revenue generation and looking at cost-saving efficiencies to collect on these revenues. And how do we get to the... You'll put up the presentation? Me?
I know.
Mike.
Sure. Yes. Getting there. Great. Thank you.
This is when we find out who the diehard people are, Rob.
As if you didn't know.
So in our agenda today, we will be covering 4 topics. The first of which is collecting money that is owed to the city. Some people refer to this as collecting the low-hanging fruit. Then looking at efficiencies in the actual collection process itself so that we are spending the least amount to collect the most. Looking at cost recovery approaches to cover the collection costs, and then potentially looking at new revenue streams. Good morning. So this is the first of a couple slides covering the collecting monies that are owed to the city. We have several categories, and they're not in any particular order, so I'll just clarify that up front. The first is taxes. The city collects a number of taxes. The revenue division is point for collecting those taxes, and when we look at how we manage our operations for collections, we do a return on investment analysis when we ask for new staff. This year in the budget process, we have requested an ad package for additional frontline collection staff in revenue and support a team in city attorney's office, a paralegal and a legal assistant to assist revenue with collecting our taxes that are owed to the city. We also have liens and foreclosures. Liens where property owners owe money to the city. We have a process now in place where we take them through to foreclosure if those liens do not get paid. There is an ad package this year, or at least a discussion between city attorney with the Bureau of Development Services for an IA to provide support for the foreclosure process. Some other categories.
Jennifer, could I ask you a question, please? So back on the taxes, the return on investment analysis. So will that be provided with any ad package that's requested this year for additional tax collection capacity?
Yes.
Yes,
Fantastic.
And it was provided. That was a question that the budget office asked us to provide, and we did provide that to them as part of the ask.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Yes. Great. Getting the technology down. So accounts receivable is another section to talk about. These are monies that are owed to the city in the normal course of our business. We do have a comprehensive financial management policy, FIN 6.04, which is called accounts receivable. It was last revised in 2006. So I will volunteer that this is time to take a look at it. It was actually written in pre-SAP days. It still references IBIS, which is the system we used before moving to SAP. So I would like to volunteer that I will spearhead a group to take a look at updating that policy. That policy is intended to provide bureaus with guidance on how to approach their accounts receivable, particularly what to do with receivables that are in the 90-day plus category. There is a question in my mind about whether our management of accounts receivable is being consistently managed, equitably managed throughout the city, so that a customer who has a receivable in one bureau, I can't tell you if their messaging is the same as they might be if they are a customer of a second bureau, but that is something that I would like us to be looking at. Related to that is our use of collection agencies. We do have a contract with a third-party collection agency, at least one contract. One.
I'm sorry, there's two. There's a subcontract.
Two. Sorry, I'm being corrected. There are two contracts. And a question in my mind, again, about whether or not we are being consistent in our use of that collection agency throughout the city, and that is something that we will be taking a look at.
In round numbers, how much are we talking about in terms of account receivable?
For accounts receivable or for the collection agencies?
Account receivable.
In our, happen to have the CAFR, our consolidated, a comprehensive financial statement from June 30th of 2017. There is a number for the city's receivables, but what I would caution you is that it is not broken out in buckets by time frame. So it's not necessarily the case that these are delinquent numbers, but in our receivable number as of the end of June of 2017, actually, this is doubtful accounts. I'm sorry. Do you have the receivable number?
Well, first of all, there's no centralized place for this. Thomas Lanham, the Revenue Division Director, and so that's why you have to actually go to different systems. The CAFR is going to show basically business-like activities and general fund debt, and so I don't have a clean answer for you today, but I can get that to you. For example, some of the debt that's on the ledger is related to the Portland Housing Bureau, and we know that much of that debt is non-performing. So rolling it up into a larger number about the overall AR for the city of Portland can be problematic.
Round number, I mean, we're talking about thousands or millions or?
We're talking millions.
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions. But again, not all of this is in the delinquent category. So according to the as of the end of June, the net receivables for the city, citywide, it looks like $258 million. But much of that may be in the 0 to 30 bucket, and we offer our partners 30 days to pay. So I'd like to do some more due diligence in order to get back to you on that.
Yeah, I mean, part of that number, right, is about $85 million of current debt at the time for water and sewer. So there's, when you write that number down for what's current versus what's 90 plus days, you get a different picture. So I think it's really that 90 plus day picture that we're interested in.
Right.
And how much do you write off annually? Uncollectible.
It really depends on the bureau. It's in the CAFR.
Right.
We would have to dig into that for you.
I will tell you, I do not think that we are doing it consistently across the city. The comprehensive financial management policy that talks about accounts receivable references writing off amounts that are older than 1 year. I don't know whether we are actually doing that.
So Jennifer, I would assume that as you do your analysis, both on accounts receivable and collection, to the degree that you find inconsistencies, are you going to write those inconsistencies? What are you going to do with that insight?
Write them, RIGHT?
Yes,
as
correct.
in correct them? Yes. Yes.
Okay,
that would be
good.
the goal.
I just want to beat the auditor to the punch since she hasn't shown up here yet.
Yes.
I want to make sure we correct that.
Right.
Good,
And
thank
I
you.
think the first thing that we need to do is write the policy so that the bureaus have guidance about what they should be doing. I don't believe that a policy that's not been looked at since 2004 or 2006 is necessarily giving good guidance to the bureaus.
Yeah, I would agree.
Right.
Good, thank you for doing
Sure.
that.
Waiting for the, great. And then two other categories related that I would like to mention about collecting monies that are owed are grant reimbursement billings and disaster-related reimbursement billings. What is important to point out, particularly regarding FEMA, is that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management, requires the city to pony up a 25% match if we are looking for reimbursement from the federal government after a disaster. So to the extent that there is an ad package for that 25% match that we do not approve, then we are not able to collect the 75 cents that FEMA would be giving us back.
Jennifer, can I just ask a clarification on that, though?
Yeah.
The city needs to put up that 25% match. You mentioned if an ad package isn't approved, but another option for council would be to ask the Bureau to find that match out of existing services.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because we have had that in the past where bureaus have said, I have to get this funding in order to get FEMA funding, but there are other alternatives the council has.
Yes.
Thanks.
So moving now to collection process efficiencies. The city has put in place several efficiencies to help reduce the cost of collecting our receivables. Over the last couple of years, the Treasury instituted a new lockbox service with our bank. A lockbox service is where, rather than the checks being mailed to the city so that the city can handle them and process them and deposit them, the customer mails a coupon along with a check to a P.O. box. The bank is paid to go to the P.O. box 4 or 5 times a day, pick up all of the mail. They process that in their own secure facility, deposit the money on our behalf to our bank account, and then send a electronic transmission which gets automatically uploaded into SAP and posts the payment. So we have instituted 2 lockboxes with the city, the first for the arts tax in 2016, which greatly reduced the amount of time to acknowledge arts tax payments and to get those monies into the bank. And the second was last year with our central accounts receivable area, at the time that was in accounting but has since been moved over to revenue. Again, those payments are being processed centrally by the bank. And we are in discussions right now with the police alarms group to set up a separate lockbox for them as well, so that they are not spending a third of their day opening the mail and posting checks and taking them to the bank. One of the other efficiencies that we have instituted are all of the online payment pages that allow customers to more easily and faster make their payments to the city. As you may recall, in 2015, we spent that year becoming payment card industry compliant, and it was after we achieved PCI compliance at the end of 2015 that our use of online payment pages dramatically took off. We've got about 40 or 50 pages set up where customers can make online payments, and we continue to see interest from the bureaus in setting up that facility. So that is an efficiency. What all of these also do, in addition to bringing efficiencies, is that they improve our internal controls so that we have fewer employees who are actually handling money, and instead the payments are being electronically processed and being deposited directly in the bank. We are finding that the bureaus that are adopting these efficiencies are internally redeploying the savings that they get. So I'm not sure that you will be able to point to a particular FTE that can be saved for adopting these efficiencies, but the bureaus are taking the staff time that was devoted to these activities and redeploying it to other activities. One of the other process efficiencies that we are aiming to employ is the integrated tax software project. This will be in our revenue division. Bless you. We are working on the RFP and anticipate issuing that in 2018. This is a system that will replace 7 or so unconnected legacy systems that we have today to collect our taxes. There is one system today for business license tax. There is a second system for arts tax. There's a third system for transient lodging tax, et cetera. They are not connected. They are legacy systems that were internally developed many years ago, and they do not integrate well, or if at all, with the federal tax information system that we have been, sorry?
Dan has a question.
Yes.
My question is, are you running this new software program by the Technology Oversight Committee?
The integrated, we had a meeting last 2 weeks ago with the Technology Executive Steering Committee and got guidance from them. I anticipate that we will be bringing this to the TOC so that they can opine about oversight.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I second that, and I had a question with regard to the federal tax information. So we heard Robert McCullough, and I think you may have been in the room when he was testifying, and he made a pointed case that we needed to continue to purchase the federal tax information. Is this system in addition to that or separate from that? How does this work with that ask?
This system, the integrated tax software system, is separate from, but will integrate with and use the information from the federal tax information system.
So we still need the tax information
Yes.
in order to make this system work. So this is really an efficiency play?
It isn't necessary to make it work necessarily. You could have an integrated tax software system without FTI, but it's a way to integrate FTI into our operations and make our operations that much more robust.
Okay, because part of his argument, it wasn't the totality of his, but part of his argument was we could do a better job of collecting business income taxes if we had access to that database. And so is this a system where the database and the business income tax payments coalesce? Is this the platform?
Yes, this is the
Okay.
platform for that to happen. Maybe you, Thomas, take a second and explain what happens today.
Sure. So what happens today, about 5 years ago, the IRS approved, actually it was 2012, the IRS approved the city of Portland to receive federal taxpayer information directly. There are a great number of physical and IT security requirements that come along with receiving that data. It took us a couple years to build that environment out, and we began receiving the data, storing the data, and using the data out of an application that's dedicated for that purpose only. So we have federal taxpayer information residing in one environment, highly secure, and then all of our business license tax information is sitting in a different environment. When we go live with the Integrated Tax System project in 2021, we don't have a timeline yet, all of that data will reside on one platform in a data warehouse so that we'll be able to more readily use it, integrate it, and right now these two systems are not integrated in any way.
So in today's environment where we have this budget ask on the table for the tax information, are we able to determine what our collection rate is on
Yes.
the business income tax? And are we able to identify significant gaps in that data?
Yes, we are. It's an inefficient usage, but it's still efficient enough to generate a positive return on investment.
Okay,
Our
and
current
do we have enough personnel to be able to do that in a timely and effective manner?
Within the integrated tax system, using the federal taxpayer information system, I think, yes, that we do.
Okay.
The
Okay.
overall problem in the revenue division, and the reason that we have an ask for 5 FTEs, is just the explosion in the number of accounts that we have to maintain. So we've got over 100,000 accounts. A few years ago, we had 65, 70,000 accounts. And so there's been a very large increase in the number of accounts. That generates a lot of workload that's really more customer service related than collecting debt or following up in an audit environment. So what we need is additional positions to help absorb that customer service work so that we can return our collection staff back to their core duties of collection.
Could you just give me a common sense example when you say a customer service role? Could you just give me an example of what that might be?
Sure. It's an inbound phone call. It's entering tax returns. It's assisting taxpayers with questions about compliance. It's the phone calls that we get back when we send outbound mail. So, for example, late in the year, after we've identified everyone that's filed or should have filed, there's usually about 20,000 accounts that we did not hear from. They had filed a tax return in a previous year but haven't filed in the current year. So that generates 20,000 letters, which generates 20,000 phone calls. And,
Okay.
so there's that core work where there isn't necessarily a check attached still has to occur. So, a few years ago, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of accounts following our making legal Uber, Lyft, where, 20,000 drivers went and got business license accounts. And what we did as an efficiency measure is we identified those accounts that we thought were Uber, Lyft drivers that really never completed the permitting process with PBOT. So they drew the initial business license, but it didn't actually carry through with the taxable business activity. So in that case, we made a decision internally to essentially batch exempt 20,000 accounts by way of being more efficient about how we manage these accounts. There's some risk to that because some of those accounts probably were performing, but we don't have perfect information. We had to make a business decision based on the workload. And so since that batch exemption, we've seen our accounts continue to skyrocket. So we're doing everything we can, Mayor, internally to try to be efficient and to focus our efforts where there's real recovery and real dollars. But that said, that customer service work continues, and it's just exploded in the last few years.
Thank you.
So moving on from efficiencies to cost recovery, the city has policies that attempt to balance cost recovery with the program's social purpose, mission, equity, and making sure that we are accessible to the constituents that we are serving. We do have another comprehensive financial management policy, 2.06, called revenue. That's the guiding policy that we use. That was last amended in 2014, and I will offer that working with the CBO, we will at least review that and see whether or not that needs any update. I'm not aware that it needs any update, but we should take a look at it and show that we are current with our review of that. What we try to do in cost recovery is balance the direction for cost recovery by implementing user fees for private use transactions. That's one of the approaches that we are seeing some of the bureaus take regarding their budget asks. We've seen that in PBOT, we've seen that in parks, and I will offer one that I've not put on the table yet, but I think would be appropriate for the city to take a look at, having it in my area of focus. Today, or 2 weeks ago, you approved a contract with a bank to be our merchant bank to allow us to process credit cards. It's a $25 million contract for 5 years. Just about every part of the city uses credit cards to offer services to the public. We have the opportunity to look at imposing convenience fees for the use of credit cards. And that would be transferring the costs that are currently being absorbed by the city to the cardholder. We charge convenience fees in 2 locations today in the city. One is in revenue for our business license tax, so that individuals paying their business license tax by credit card will pay an additional 3% for the convenience of using that card. The second is with Parking Kitty, which is the phone app that PBOT uses so that people can use their phone to pay for their street parking. The consumer pays an additional 10 cents for the convenience on top of whatever the base parking charge is. The card brands are very strict about the use of convenience fees and surcharges, and so I've asked our partner bank to take a look at all of our business and come back to us with some guidance about where we could, if we wanted, to impose fees for the use of credit cards. One of the core features of this option is that there has to be available other options for the consumer. They have to be able to pay through other mechanisms, and the convenience fee is truly that, just a fee for the convenience of using the card. So it is meant to preserve the equity and the accessibility of the base service, but providing a way to recover the fees from consumers who want that convenience.
So I have a question related to that, which is, it makes me wonder if the other mechanisms through which someone might conceivably pay for the service, other than a credit card, are ones that have a greater cost for the city to absorb. Say if someone were paying with a cash or check and that had to be processed, you would have to weigh
Yes.
the driving of consumers to a more expensive process from the city against the amount that you're collecting from the.
Correct.
So I just want to raise that as a concern, that if you start charging people more to use a credit card and some of those consumers respond by saying, okay, I'll pay cash, then that means you're, as a city, you're spending more time processing cash, which is something that is less convenient for the city and incurs a higher cost.
Except if people switch to direct debit, which I don't think has any cost, right? And certainly, I mean, I would change my behavior because I get a cash back from my credit card for paying by credit card. I don't have to pay anything paid by debit.
Right.
I don't get anything. So that I would change my behavior.
At the end of the day, all of the features that are attached to the credit cards that we use, frequent flyer miles, cash back, et cetera, are borne by the merchant. We're paying for those features that the cardholders have. So I'm suggesting that there may be an opportunity to take a look at this and then have a policy discussion about what we want to do, whether we want to do something, what we can do. And part of that absolutely will be looking at what the alternative costs are. It's not free to process coin in the meters. There are people who have to go pick it up. There are people who have to count it. They have to bring it to the bank, et cetera. Every place that we do online, every place that we do offer consumers an opportunity to use a card, we also simultaneously offer them an ACH or an electronic option, which is, for all intent and purposes, free because Treasury absorbs those costs. They are extremely cheap. We're not forcing anybody to use cards. We're giving them the option to use cards. We should just recognize that there is a pretty substantial cost associated with that and that we are absorbing that cost today.
Does Parking Kitty take direct debit?
No, it's card-based, right? So the alternative to using Parking Kitty is to park your car, get up and walk to the meter and put coins in the meter, or use a card at the meter. And using a card at the meter does not incur that additional 10-cent convenience fee because you're not using your phone, you're actually using the meter. But then we are paying merchant fees for that card transaction at the meter.
Yeah, it would be interesting. We'll have some data on how many people are using Parking Kitty versus getting out of their car and using their card.
Right.
And then again, if you have a choice, I don't think you can use your debit card at the meter. I think it's only credit cards.
No, you can use your debit card.
All
Yeah,
right.
but it's processed
But why
as
would I? Because
credit.
I'm getting my cash back on my credit card. You can't use cash anymore. Right. Right. No, that's problematic.
So these are all really teeny dollar amount impacts that we're talking about, but in terms of volume, the city processes, I don't know, $9 or $10 million card transactions a year related to our parking system. So it's the dollar impacts per transaction are really small, but it's the volume that is ramping up and causing us to spend a lot.
Jennifer, what is the total amount of transaction fees that we are absorbing?
I'd have to get back to you on that.
I'd be curious to know. And do other cities absorb the transaction fee?
It depends, and a lot of times it depends on the state. Certain states, like Missouri, have laws that prevent them from charging fees. We don't have a law like that in Oregon, but it does come down to the card brand rules about what can be charged when and where and what type of transaction. And that's the analysis that I want the bank to come back and tell us what we can do.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So the last category that our agenda covers is potential new revenue streams. And you're familiar with many of the new taxes that we have established over the last few years. Marijuana tax, heavy vehicle use tax, gas tax, CEO compensation surtax, and the arts tax. Some of the alternatives we have would be to increase a rate of an existing tax. In terms of bringing in new revenue, this is the most cost-efficient way because the system is already in place to charge that tax, and an adjustment to the rate would increase the revenue from that stream. Another alternative would be to look at imposing new taxes, and some of the ones that I'm familiar with and have seen discussions about over the last many months include cell phone tax, food and beverage tax, and a soda tax. So just putting those on the table as giving you a sense of what we've done previously and what some of the options going forward for us might be, depending on your level of interest. Question?
Yeah, tell us more about a cell phone tax. Where is that used? How does it work? What does it generate?
So I can speak to that to a depth, and then after that I'll turn to other staff who know more. But the assessment really is on wireless activity, and you have to be careful about which activity the tax applies to. So we can't tax access to the internet, but we can tax the telephonic usage piece of the bill. We modeled the tax here. I think it was just last year we did an update for one or more council offices, and we had a tax on wireless communications analysis that indicated about $7 to $8 million gross could be collected here in the city of Portland. As to other jurisdictions, I would need to call up some staff for that. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. Shall I do that? Yeah. Can somebody speak to that? Whether jurisdictions have a cell phone tax?
Like Washington.
Washington
The
State?
state of Washington would be an example.
Okay.
Yeah.
State of Washington?
Yeah, statewide, we're the lowest tax, and Washington is the highest. Ours is about 1%, and theirs is about 18%, or maybe even more. We looked into this as from my office because I was very interested. One thing, there's a lot of equity considerations to this, because I was thinking, well, you know, if you have a cheaper system, a cheaper phone, you're going to not pay as much tax if it's a percentage. But it turns out that low-income people are more likely to have cell phones as their only telephone service and more likely to use it for their sole source of internet access. So it actually doesn't, there's a lot to be considered before we move down that path.
Thomas, can I ask, and I just haven't, and you may not have this today, but in terms of the number of people with landlines versus cell phones, I remember 10 years ago we were sort of tracking this very steady decline in a utility license collections based on landlines going away. I assume that trend has continued. Do you have those numbers?
It has. I don't have the numbers. The cable utilization, a lot of people are cutting the cord on the cable too. Do we?
We can get back. Yeah, it was just, it's been a long, steady decline, which actually has an impact on our general fund as that utility license tax continues to decline as people switch over to cell phones. So,
I may have my own sort of naive misconception about this, but my idea as a consumer of services is that usually when you put a tax in place, the tax is responsive to a service that's being offered. So for the utility access, the city has a role in permitting and all the other things associated with that, and that incurs a cost to the city that has to be borne. And whether or not the tax covers the cost and generates excess or not is a separate question. But in this case, for the cell phone tax, one would have to wonder what is it that the consumer is getting in response for paying this tax associated with this thing that they've been using in the past and not been taxed for, right? So, I mean, that's just beware of pushback from consumers.
So I don't disagree with that, except that the most I pay in taxes is to the federal government, and they use it for whatever they want. I mean, it has nothing to do with my income at all. But the other issue, and maybe this is really for the next session when we get to sustainability, is here we are again in a cut year. The reality is, if we had had the same budget cycle 10 years ago, we would have a surplus. And the reason we're talking about reductions, including closing community centers, is because we now have new responsibilities, including the $28 million in general fund that go towards the Joint Office of Homeless Services. So we've created entire new areas of demand for general fund resources because the people we work for expect us to address it. but there is no commensurate increase in revenues. So we have our finite revenue stream, but burgeoning demands on that revenue stream. And so we find ourselves in this constant environment where we're trying to figure out which of the services do our bosses want that we're going to have to cut. And so for me, the revenue, while I agree with you, Rob, that you know, in a purist sense, you want a revenue to be directly related or at least have some at least tenuous relationship. I can't think of what it is you would quote tax or charge a fee to that actually addresses a humanitarian crisis and a livability issue. And so for me, I'm starting to move off of that dime a little bit and think about what does it actually take to create a sustainable, effective government that delivers the service the people who hire us say they want us to deliver.
I completely understand your perspective on that. I mean, we understand that there's a structural and systematic underfunding of road infrastructure, of parks maintenance and infrastructure. I mean, you know, every year we have this conversation, and we know that with the crisis in people experiencing houselessness and the city's response to that, there's a serious issue there too. But I think to the extent that it's possible to put in places, you know, and people are willing and have demonstrated that willingness to vote for gas taxes and vote for housing bonds and things like that. So I think to the extent that you can connect those dots, you're going to have a much more robust response from the Portland community. Portland residents care about that stuff, and I think they're willing to put their money where their values are.
So on that line, I think of these options, the food and beverage tax, the restaurant food and beverage tax is the one that is most optional and that people who have lower incomes don't have the access to. So to me, there's a connection between that. Excuse me. It also has the virtue that all those tourists coming in would be paying it, which would be good. I know when I go to Ashland to see plays, I pay their tax. I always thought it went to education. It turns out it goes to sewers. At least most of it does. So it's, yeah. I feel a little less good about helping to pay for the residents of Ashland sewers, but I'm sure they put other resources elsewhere.
There's an important dynamic here too in Oregon, which is somewhat unique in terms of our property tax system and the limitations on that. So our property tax rate is defined in the Constitution and cannot change. So it grows only when we have development or, you know, property values grow, and there's a connection there, a very complicated, you know, issue. When I get together with finance, you know, officials in other states and other cities, the big question they have every year in their budget is, do we raise our property taxes this year, right? Do we raise our millage rates? And there's, you know, political issues around that, and there's, you know, and a lot of states have limitations of different sorts, but that's not even an option Portland has. So when the mayor talks about these new services, we don't get to come back as part of our process and say, are Portlanders willing to pay additional property taxes for providing homeless services, providing, you know, emergency management, et cetera, which is why I think we find ourselves going to some of these other you know, sources of revenue, because that tool really was taken away from us 20 years ago.
And if I could go back to the idea of a rate increase of an existing tax, I'd like Thomas to speak about the business license tax and give you some context for how to think about that.
So the business license tax has been at 2.2% of net income with some deductions since the 1970s. Right now, if the council were to consider a rate increase, I can't think, in my recent memory in 15 years with the division, I can't think of a better year, simply because most businesses are looking at substantial federal tax relief in tax year 2018. If the council desired, you move the rate to say 2.3%, would yield an additional $4.5 million per year ongoing. If you move that rate to 2.4%, I think that's also a modest adjustment. Now you're looking at just this side of $9 million ongoing per year. So coupling a modest increase with substantial federal relief, in addition to the fact that this is well-trodden ground for the city. Wouldn't draw a lawsuit, certainly would draw obviously some feedback from the business community, but in terms of its legality, in terms of the administration cost, in terms of there'd be no changes there whatsoever. It'd be very easy to implement something like that. So for your consideration.
Thomas, can you remind me where we are on the owner's compensation deduction?
It's right around 100,000. Is it, what's the current owner's comp? 103. It's grown a little bit.
That's certainly intriguing. So I just wanted to mention one more thing on the soda tax, which is that it's still early days yet, but it may be worth holding off a little bit and looking too hard into that with what's going on with IP 37. I mean, if they pass that, it's off the table.
So we've covered looking at our policies and process for collecting monies owed, and I'll be coming back to you with revisions to the policy regarding our accounts receivable and our use of collections. We've talked about collection process efficiencies and redeploying the efficiencies that we are able to gain internally within the bureaus. We will be looking at more lockbox operations, et cetera. I'm open to any ideas that people have about how to more efficiently collect the money that we are owed. We talked briefly about cost recovery, and I volunteered that I will be looking at our merchant fees and coming back to you with an analysis of what we may be able to do there for your consideration. And we covered new revenue streams, putting some thoughts in front of you about how to approach that. So that is the material that we prepared for you. You're welcome.
Rob? Did you have
I had one more sort of area that I wanted to ask about, which is, so my understanding is that the city is responsive to low-income homeowners who are having issues with permitting related to improvements that are required by code on their properties. And I was just wondering, for foreclosures and liens, what the standard operating procedure is for a low-income homeowner who's having trouble making their tax payments. Like, what are the general guidelines for how long someone can be in arrears before they're going to be foreclosed? If there are payment plans, structured payment plans that can be put in place for because. The last thing we want to do for someone of modest means who's having a hard time getting their tax bill paid is to throw them out of their house and then have to fund their housing through the Joint Office of Homeless Services. So I would love to hear what is being done in that area. Thanks.
So the City Code Section 5.30 discusses liens and assessments, and it is the city auditor's purview through the foreclosure manager, to work with property owners who have liens outstanding on their property. And the foreclosure manager works with them to set them up on payment plans. To the extent that they can come to an agreement about that, the homeowner is put on a payment plan. If they continue to be delinquent, there is also a collections committee that the city auditor is responsible for convening. I'd have to look at the code to tell you about the composition of that committee. But the committee looks at all of the interactions with the property owner to evaluate whether or not they've been given sufficient opportunity to develop a payment plan, adhere to the payment plan, and account for all of the issues impacting that homeowner. And the collections committee then gives their recommendation about moving a particular property to foreclosure or not. Then it's up to the city auditor to bring properties to council.
Thank you. I worry about this most when it comes to fixed income seniors and retirees. I mean, if property taxes, ostensibly they can cover them, but sometimes when I'm attending the town halls of our legislators, I hear low-income seniors talk about property taxes as being something that's very difficult for them to handle.
And property taxes would be managed at the county level for delinquent property taxes. So far, the city's efforts regarding foreclosures have been targeted to vacant and abandoned properties.
Yeah, I was just going to add, the city council just foreclosed on 3 properties. It is a very rare circumstance that we actually get to foreclosure, and even when we get to foreclosure, there's still a year time period by which the owner can make payments or reach an agreement. And the ones that finally make their way to the council. I mean, out of the hundreds that are currently on the rolls, the 3 that made it to us have, I mean, they're barely standing at this point. They're clear community nuisance issues, and there have been innumerable efforts to work with the owners, which are often either banks or absentee owners, over a period of many, many years. I think one of the properties that we just foreclosed, it's been 18 years.
Right.
So this is not an aggressive aspect of our government. It is an extremely rare circumstance.
That's very reassuring. Thank you.
Yep. This was ginned up 2 years ago after being dormant for 40-plus years. And of the 13 properties that the council has approved for foreclosure, they've all resolved before actually being sold at the foreclosure bid that I conducted in City Hall. The one property that actually went to the auction, there were no bids at the auction, but within 30 days it resolved in a private sale. So it's been the threat of foreclosure that has made folks attend to the outstanding liens rather than the property actually being sold through foreclosure itself. Sure.
Thank you, Jennifer and Thomas. I appreciate it. So colleagues, we could do one of 2 things. We could take a break now. My preference would be that we go forward with the innovative financial sustainability approaches and then take a longer break after. Would that?
I'd appreciate 5 minutes now.
Why don't we take 5 minutes now? And we'll come back and start in 5 minutes. And then we'll take a little bit of a longer break after this as well. Thank you. We are in recess. sustainability practices. This is a special topic that I asked for today because Portland's financial sustainability is one of the most significant issues that we face during this budget process. And as I noted last November, I'll be proposing a budget that addresses the urgent issues of today while also making long-term shifts that put Portland on what I hope will be a more sustainable financial path. Bureaus have been asked to focus on their core missions and either put up for or consider elimination of programs that are not consistent with their core programs or our programs that they cannot make a case should be moved to a different location. And second of all, obviously as a council, we've talked about this, we need to be aware of the long-term impacts of the decisions that we make, whether we're creating new programs or addressing labor contracts or underinvesting in infrastructure. Each of the decisions impacts Portlanders over the long run, and we need to be cognizant of those impacts. So today I've asked CBO to come forward to all of us here and identify some potential strategies that will position the city for a more sustainable financial future. With that, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that introduction. And, you know, I'm joined here by Jennifer Cooperman, the Chief Financial Officer, and Tom Reinhardt, Chief Administrative Officer. And Cyrilda Summers-McGee, our HR Director, will be here. She had a conflict, so she'll be here at about 11 for her portion of the presentation. But, you know, it's reflective, I think, of the types of things we're going to be talking about today on this agenda across a lot of areas. And there are a lot of enterprise-wide solutions that we're putting on the table. And so it's been really kind of fun, frankly, over the last couple of weeks to begin to brainstorm on some of these and talk to my colleagues and really start thinking about what are the things that will help put us on that sustainable path. The agenda, and we'll go ahead and put the slide up, Sarah. The agenda today, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about cost drivers, but I'm not going to spend very long on that because we really want to move to some of these innovative solutions and innovative strategies for these key issues. And they really are in four different areas. We're going to talk about how we can manage our programmatic cost growth in the city a little bit differently. We're going to talk about infrastructure and major maintenance costs, and I know we've already done some presentations to council about that, but we've got some ideas that are really forward-looking in terms of how we can take the next step on infrastructure. We're going to talk a little bit about PERS, the liability there, and although it's a pretty intractable problem, there are some things we might be able to do in the future, and we also want to highlight what an impact it does have on our budget. And then finally, overall, managing personnel costs and some different things we might be able to do in that regard. So slide 3, and I want to spend a few minutes on this because there's a lot of really interesting and I think useful information on this slide. So what we're trying to show here is over the last 4 years, so going back to the 2014-15 budget all the way up through the current fiscal year, 2017-18, what's happened in terms of our budget and where has the excess money, the surplus that we've experienced in this period of time gone? What you can see in that top line there is that the total additional investments over this period of time were $97.5 million. This represents a 5.9% average general fund discretionary growth over that 4-year period. That is significantly higher than our historical, and you can see that the other dotted line there to the left. Our historical average growth, if you go back 15 years, so since about 2002, has been about 4.5%. And that's the average growth. So that does include the Great Recession, right, which obviously was very low growth, and in fact a couple of years where our general fund discretionary fell in real terms. But you can see over the last 4 years how much better things have been, and that really is a pretty dramatic increase in our overall general fund. But what we've done below that is break out where those funds went. And I think in terms of things I want to highlight, one of the most important things that we don't talk a lot about, but maybe should talk a little bit more about, is how much inflation on our base budget eats up of our additional funding. So you can see there in terms of personnel and external M&S, EM&S is external M&S. These are the goods and services that we as a city buy. So what we pay for our people and what we pay for our goods and services ate up about $46.6 million of that excess funding. It makes sense. We expect inflation to grow between 2% and 4%. But this does limit, council's ability to invest in other programs and other expenditures. So of that surplus, only about 40% has really been what council's had discretion on. And the other thing I would add there, in addition to that personnel, if you drop 2 lines down to PERS, we're also treating this as non-discretionary. This is a rate that we pay that the state, gives us. And so adding those two things together, about 60% of that excess has just gone automatically to those things, meaning that about 40% has been left over for other things. We've then broken out what those other items are. And you can see in terms of new adds and cuts, we've added about $15.5 million net. However, it's worth noting that we actually added about $40 million in new ongoing programs. At the same time, we've cut $24 million of programs over that 4-year period of time. So again, this is when you hear from some of the bureaus who have testified and they've talked about some of those reductions. They really have felt those, right? $24 million of reductions over the last 4 years. On the other hand, we've made some very large new investments in other programs as well. And this gets what the mayor talked about, in our last session about some of these new demands in the community and these new services that we're providing. Labor agreements that have been approved over the last few years are just under $9 million. And I want to stress that that does include the PPA agreement, but this is the cost through 17-18, so it's actually not fully implemented yet. So if you remember with the PPA agreement, it was a few $1 million every year, and so we're in year 2 of that agreement, so those dollars will go up in the future as well. We included something there for backfilling previous reductions, just to separate that out. So there were some reductions that were taken by council in this period of time that were then, or actually these are reductions that might have been taken back during the Great Recession that were then added back through subsequent budget decisions. And finally, ongoing infrastructure spending at about $6.3 million. Any questions on that before?
I guess I'm just kind of curious. I mean, I know you go to the Government Finance Officers Association conferences all the time, so how does this fingerprint compare with other cities?
So we're significantly better than other cities, and Josh Harwood had a slide that we included last in the council work session last October that sort of showed, looking at the National League of Cities data, which looks at a whole bunch of cities nationwide. Across the country, cities are just getting back to their pre-recession levels of general fund. Whereas Portland has been on a steady upward path. We recovered and have greatly exceeded where we were before the recession. So, and there's a lot of factors to that. We know that this is a very high demand city with a lot of people moving here, but we have done better than other cities.
Okay, thanks.
So moving on then from ongoing, I wanted to talk just briefly about one time, and this is, a different side, of the equation. We have made over the same time period of this last 4 years some really important and fiscally responsible decisions, with these one-time revenues. It's pretty remarkable to me, though, when we look at the totals. It's $160 million of excess one-time that was invested during this time period. And what this chart reflects is where that one-time has been spent. And you can see that just, programmatic carryovers, these are things council approves in the bump. There's been some technology investments, which is good. Infrastructure investments of almost $50 million. This is just through 2017-18. That number is going to grow quite a bit as part of this 18-19 budget process as well. Significant investments there. But then still almost $83 million of what we just termed as other ads, because it was hard to really categorize these. You have a table there, inlaid table within this chart that shows what some of those are. This gets to about 3/4 of that $83 million. Housing and homelessness, by far the largest amount, $34 million of one-time has been invested there over the last 4 years. Special appropriations was just a little over $10 million of one-time. Transportation's got a large chunk at $5 million, police at $4.4 million, ONI, the General Fund Reserve. General Fund Reserve, by the way, is an automatic thing. We have a financial policy that keeps our General Fund Reserve at 10%. So when the General Fund grows significantly, we have to make investments to keep that at 10%. So that's automatically done as part of the forecast, but an additional $3.3 million there. Youth Bus Pass and PDC Prosper. Everything below that, though, there's still, I think, roughly $20 million not included in this chart, and it really is very small, $1 million things, a few $100,000 here, a few $100,000 there. I think what I wanted to highlight most with this chart was just that these these investments can be really meaningful, and I think we see that on infrastructure and technology, and we see it, in housing and homelessness, dealing with some of the crisis. But when we invest our one-time funding in programs, it often does create the future expectation that funding will be there. And so, it creates that pressure on council and the city to find the ongoing resources as those one-time programs end every year. And that can squeeze some of our other ongoing priorities in the city. Any questions on one-time spending? So those were the context slides. And now I'm going to, just to remind us where we've been in the last 4 years, I'm going to move on now to some of the future strategy issues and things that I think we should would be good for the city to talk about that might, again, begin to reframe a little bit the decisions we make and think about the long-term consequences of those decisions. So in terms of future strategies, one of the first questions is, how do we manage the programmatic expenditure growth? And again, as I mentioned, there have been a lot of new programs added. There's been a lot of one-time funding added. One potential strategy to address this risk posed by the one-time programmatic investments is to require that all one-time decision packages include a plan that details how and precisely when the program will transition off of general fund resources. This is something that we don't really ask our bureaus to do now. They come forward with one-time requests. One-time, by definition, on our financial policies, has to be spent on short-term, temporary pilot projects. But we know from a lot of bureaus that they really are making these requests with the intent of coming back and asking for ongoing in the future. One thing we could do is require bureaus, if they're making a one-time request, to talk about how the program will end. How will it be phased out? How will the people being served by the program be notified? How will the staff be laid off? How will we essentially sunset that program? I think it really would require bureaus to think through that issue, and it would require council, as they look at funding one time, to ask that question. Is it truly a pilot project? Is it truly a one-time expenditure that will go away? Or is there an expectation here for more in the future? Additionally, I think a second strategy that would allow council to assess the value and benefit of some of our new ongoing programs in relation to other city priorities is to require that new programs be reviewed by council and reauthorized, after a period of time. We threw 3 years on here, but it could be 2 years, it could be 4 or 5 years. This is something that really it's very common in state government, and it's very common at the federal level that programs have to be reauthorized periodically. And I think this is something the city can discuss. It could be done for all programs, coming back on a 3, 4, 5 year cycle. It could also just be done for new programs, right? That if we're establishing a new program, what were the intended goals of it? What were the intended outcomes? And have that program come back to council after a period of time and report back on whether they achieved those things. But this would, again, it gives council an opportunity to review that and really compare that program to some of the other priorities that may have come up in the meantime to decide if it's where we want to continue reallocating our resources. Finally, another strategy to ensure the city can continue to plan and responsibly address our large financial risks involves coordination between bureaus about what those large enterprise risks are. This is something that Chief Administrative Officer Reinhardt has, it's one of his top priorities for this year. He's already begun convening people in terms of taking this enterprise risk management look. And Tom, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to that effort.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, I have been gathering the leaders at this table here, the CFO, the budget director, myself, the city attorney, and the Bureau of Human Resources director. It's a very common practice in most cities across the country, and that is to catalog significant enterprise risks, to score them, and to manage them with council regularly so that not just in budget decision when you're making decisions on a policy level, but throughout the year you can see how we're doing. One specific example from last week, I gathered some leaders from various bureaus that are all involved in thinking through the future of how we work together on the Superfund Portland Harbor cleanup. We need to be doing this regularly as this legacy liability really needs to be handled and allocated over in the next several years. And really there has not been a place where that is standard. There have been good leaders leading on that individually, but what we were trying to do is institute a regular practice that you as council can count on and that you're seeing the scores from us of how we're doing so that it informs your decisions. And I'm very excited that people have been interested in this and have been putting their shoulder to it. And I'm going to be visiting at least one other city to research their own process.
Questions from council about the programmatic expenditures and potential strategies there?
So the council could do any of these things at any time. Are you proposing more of a consistent policy? Are you proposing a charter reform? What are you proposing? Or are you just supposing this?
We are essentially, we sort of brainstormed on what some ideas are. We want to put those ideas on the table and really just get the reaction from council about which of those you want us to move forward with. You're right, council, these particular ideas, again, Tom's already moving forward on enterprise risks. I think that's taken care of. The reauthorization of new programs is a decision council could take at any time. You could do it on a citywide basis, or you could do it on a very specific program by program basis. And so we certainly could draft financial policies that deal with reauthorization. It's also something council could do on a piecemeal basis. And then in terms of the one-time decision packages, that is something, again, it could be incorporated into financial plans. It could also just be part of our normal budget process, that as we review these one-time expenditures, that we ask these questions about the phase out of that program.
Commissioner Fritz?
Have you looked at whether one-time things that are asked for in bumps are more likely to become ongoing than one-time things that are in the actual budget?
It's a good question, and I haven't looked at that specifically. We certainly could go back and separate out one-time funding that's in the budget versus a bump process to see what happens to it.
Yeah, I think that clarity is part of what I'm interested in. I mean, there are some things that you're just trying, and there's others that, well, we're just getting in the bump. We don't have ongoing money in the bump, but people can be clear that they are going to ask for it in the budget. But then how that then plays out when you've got somebody in the position and it's that versus something that a bureau wants to do. So I think it would be interesting to do that analysis.
Okay.
So while some of these sound great, like requiring one-time decision packages to include a plan to transition off general fund resources, I know what the answer to that question is 90% of the time, which is we will show you that it is so valuable and so important that you will prioritize it in your next budget. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard that. There are some things that we do that I believe are truly one-time packages, so we're not really talking about those. Like if we're paying down a debt stream or something like that, that's sort of a no-brainer. It's the ones where we are funding something that is seen as an urgent community priority that's important, or it's brought to the city council and people say, will you support this? And they make a good case and we agree with that case. I always feel like it's important for us to put the disclaimer on the table that this is not a permanent arrangement.
I think those things can actually exist at the same time. So a bureau can come forward and say, look, this is a pilot project. We hope to prove its worth. I think having a plan would include two things. It would be, at what point does the bureau come back to council and show the results of the program? So really saying like that's going to happen. So that,
and I agree. So I think sort of bullet point number one isn't really that productive. Bullet point number two gets towards more of a strategy, and it's more consistent with what foundations do when they give resources to a nonprofit or to a community organization. They say, okay, we hear your top line message, we hear your narrative, we agree with the need and the demand for what it is you're proposing, we agree with the leadership team you have in place that they're capable of pulling it off. Go out and prosper and come back in 2 years and tell us what you did with it. We could formalize that part of the process. I'd like to believe we are that rigorous, and I know, for example, through the Children's Fund, that's already built into the structure of the program, and it seems to work very effectively.
Right.
And maybe there are ways we could strengthen the way we do this through policy.
Yes.
So I'm more attracted to the number 2 and number 3 than I am number 1.
Okay.
I just feel like I know what the answer is going to be on number 1, so why waste the paper?
Well, and the other thing about that is the biggest of the one-time packages is the houselessness work and the Joint Office of Homeless Services. And basically we're one-time funding that because we hope at some point it's not going to be ongoing, and also because we just don't have that amount of money in the ongoing that's available.
Yeah, and I agree with that 100%. And frankly, of all of the line items in our budget that I'm the most concerned about, that's it. I mean, when I look at LA and their expenditure rate and how quickly they've gotten to a $1.5 billion level of expenditure, I don't think anybody here thinks the homeless situation is going to go away anytime soon. So we have to really start thinking about how do we integrate this into the responsibilities that we have with finite resources. And we have not come up with a good solution to do that.
Agreed.
I was just going to say that, you know, when I think about this, there's a lot of core services that the city offers that we do not anticipate are going to change anytime in our lifetimes. But I just wonder, by limiting yourself to just new programs, if there aren't things that the city does that maybe you need to do less of over the course of time that are not necessarily new programs, but may be a fruitful way to, and I know that that's part of what the whole 5% cuts exercise is about, is having bureaus look internally and try and make decisions about where they could do some scaling. But I wonder about just limiting it to new programs, if there might be some existing programs that might be warrant that kind of scrutiny.
So I think that's a great point. And in addition to this, there are other things going on. You know, the 5% somewhat gets at that, but one of the things the mayor asked us to do this year is start a deep dive process. And the first bureaus we are doing that for is transportation and housing. And the goal is to really take the more comprehensive look at those bureau budgets. And I think depending on how this year's deep dive goes, the mayor has said this may be something he wants to do for all city bureaus in the future. And there are other tools as well. A few years back we did a 90-10 budget exercise during the Great Recession, which got at some of those programs. There's zero-based budgeting, there's modified zero-based budgeting, and as program offers that the county does. So there are lots of different tools and techniques that can begin to get at that. But I 100% agree with you. This was really focused on how do we make sure the new things we're adding are achieving the results. But 100% there are things in our core base that we should be reevaluated as well.
Could I add one thing to the list, and maybe it's not appropriate for this particular area, maybe it's really in the capital expenditure bucket as opposed to ongoing programmatic expenditures. But we had, Chief Myers is here, and I appreciate the fact that he has shown up for every one of these sessions. We had a really good conversation the other day about potential reserves throughout all of our bureaus. And we happened to have the conversation at the Fire Bureau because the chief was here and he was engaging in that conversation. That any one of our bureaus, we could talk about things where when something is going to become obsolete and it's critical to your delivery of core services, and yet there's no reserving, there's no planning for future investments. And I feel like that needs to be reflected here somewhere as well if we're going to talk about financial sustainability.
Yeah, so we actually have a slide that Jennifer will get to just in a few minutes. So it's a good segue. Let's jump back to the slide deck. So slide number 6, and you've seen all this data before, so I won't belabor this, but just to remind you, the greatest risk to the city really comes with our future liabilities, and our infrastructure major maintenance backlog is one of those primary liabilities that is facing the city. Thank you. The average annual funding gap is estimated at $310 million per year for the next 10 years to address both our immediate needs and maintain those current levels of service. We have taken really important measures. We talked about those at the first work session that we had, but I think there's more that can be done. And so I want to dive into some of those future-looking strategies.
What is RRR?
Sorry, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement. In terms of current strategies, just as a reminder, the citywide asset managers group, I think, has become more and more robust over the last few years. These are the asset managers from all the infrastructure bureaus, and their work and cooperation is really critical to maintaining the city's long-term, financial health, resiliency, and operations of our programs. They've been really helpful in defining the size of the funding gap, which is an important and necessary step. Although we're going to talk about how we take the next step on that as well. And I think they've really helped with some of the citywide planning with, again, some future things we can do. One of the things, So I want to note, the CAMG, the new revenues, which have totaled over $250 million if you look at all the different things we've done in terms of the parks bond, the gas tax, Build Portland, housing bond, et cetera. But then the last thing is we do have an existing city financial policy, so this is on the books, it's been there for a long time, that whenever bureaus identify a significant gap between their need to maintain or modernize their capital assets equipment and the funds available for such improvements, the bureau director shall present a strategy for meeting those needs to the city budget office and the commissioner in charge. The practice of this, to be totally frank, has been somewhat inconsistent. I think we can point to the Bureau of Environmental Services and their efforts over the last couple of years to do exactly this, right? They've identified this gap, they've looked at where they are in terms of their overall rate methodology, and they've said, how do we close that gap? How do we put a financial plan in place that closes that gap? But some of our other infrastructure bureaus have really struggled. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about here in the next few slides is what can we do to help these bureaus, further define what that is, and really begin to put together some of these plans so that whether or not we can fund them, at least we know what the size of the gap is and we're moving towards that solution. Rather than just talking about how big the problem is, we begin talking about what the solution is. So I think step one in that process is really making sure that we have the data to drive the solution. As I noted, it's really been over the last decade, our asset managers have done an incredible job of really defining what some of the gap is. But there's another step we need to take, and it involves condition assessment. And what robust condition assessment does, it allows for the more data-informed decision-making to how we invest in our assets rather than just the informed guesswork in terms of where we should spend our money. And it really is a necessary precondition for cost-efficient asset management. As I mentioned, BES not only is putting this financing plan together, but they've really undertaken the system-wide conditions assessment with the intent of developing a long-term capital plan. And I think Jonas Beery is here in case council does have any questions about what BES has been doing in this regard. And then in terms of long-term planning, the plans that the city needs to develop would allow us to invest in our assets that are critical for service delivery and that also have the highest return on investment. The ultimate goal here is to have a long-range capital plan that's optimized for the lowest cost solution to funding our infrastructure gap. So I want to talk, we did some research on other cities, and I just want to talk really briefly about Washington, D.C. They have not always been held up as a prime example of urban government, but I think actually in the last 10 years, they've made some incredible strides in a lot of areas, and infrastructure is one of those. Washington, D.C.'s budget office develops their annual capital budgets, as most budget offices do, but they also have worked on developing a long-range capital plan that's designed to find the lowest cost solution to funding D.C.'s infrastructure gap. And really what they did is they took this 30-year look and they said, this is our current level of investment. And if we stay on this level of investment, here are the resources we're going to, the infrastructure we'll take care of, the infrastructure we won't, and here's what will be 30 years from now. And then they said, what if we really boosted that level of investment to what we need to take care of the resources? And we talk about, our shortfall here in the city of over $300 million. They said, well, what if we took care of a really large portion of that? What would that mean in the long run? Not surprising, it means that after 30 years, your assets are in significantly better condition, right? Instead of just sort of basically, maintaining this bare minimum, they're in better condition, but the cost is also cheaper. And we know this from a transportation example, right? That if we take care of the streets now, and they were able to quantify that and show that the dollars invested now have a 5% return over that entire period of time in terms of that weighted return on investment for what they're making. And they also said, they didn't necessarily want to address just the immediate funding gap, but really identify the solutions that would solve their problem over 30 years. This is the next step that Portland needs to take. We've done a lot of identification, we have a lot of information, but we need to take that next step to figure out what would investment now mean? What does a $50 million investment in Build Portland mean now when we look out 20 years from now? What would a $600 million investment mean? And how can we start moving in that direction? Step two, in addition to just finding the data, is to really do more action to identify and prioritize funding. We've done a lot, but again, there are more things we can do here. So one of the first things we note is how do we as a city plan for voter-approved bonds? I think it's fair to say that GO bond funding is an absolutely essential part of the solution. And we've taken advantage of that. We have the Parks bond. If you go back, we've got public safety apparatus bond from a few years ago. And then we've seen other governments in the region do GO bonds as well. One of the problems we have is the competing interests, and those are competing interests both within the city and also among other governments in terms of these GO bonds. There is a price of government that Portlanders are willing to pay. It's relatively high compared to other governments, but at some point we will reach that limit. And we saw that the most recent school bond passed, but we saw a failure of a school bond a few years ago. And I think we want to make sure that we are strategizing carefully in terms of what comes to the ballot, when it comes to the ballot, and how large that request is, to make sure that we can use this as part of our strategy and that we don't get sideways with the taxpayers of Portland. And also that we don't get sideways with other governments, that we know what they're planning, they know what we're planning, and we can scale these things out into the future. So one of the recommendations that we're making here is that the city establish a coordinated bond planning process, whereby a work group that involves council office executives, it involves OMF, the Bureau of Revenue Financial Services, the CAO, government relations, and other relevant parties within the city plan for what we need to do on GO bonds, and then start reaching out to other governments to figure out what they're doing as well. And again, I think a coordinated approach here is going to be essential to help solve this problem. A second solution is to increase our capital set-aside funding. We are dedicating 50% of one-time carryover funding in the fall bump and one-time resources identified in the budget process towards the capital set-aside. We could increase that. Again, this is a decision council could make at any time to bump that up to 70, 75% or higher. And again, those resources have been really successful in solving some of our issues over the last few years, and I think can continue to be in the future. Identifying any opportunities we have for public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships can be a little bit dicey sometimes, but there are opportunities here, and we can learn from other jurisdictions that have had both successes and failures in terms of what to do. But actually, PBOT is a bureau that has sought some of these dollars and has a proposal in terms of their traffic signal improvement needs, and trying to see if they can leverage some private dollars to make some of those investments as well. And then finally, looking at ways to increase our ongoing general fund resources for major maintenance. And there are different strategies here. Most of the bureaus that have major maintenance, they have some funding for it, but it's not enough, and it doesn't allow them to keep up. Parks is a classic example of this. There are ways that we can just steadily start increasing those major maintenance funds so that the problem isn't getting any worse. We can do that through just planned current appropriation level increases to these budgets until we get to the recommended levels. We can also look at reallocating resources within those bureaus. As we discussed during the Parks budget session, one of the things that CBO is recommending is reductions within the Parks Bureau in order to increase their major maintenance funding. That can be very painful, but I think it's an honest assessment of what are the services we can afford today versus what are the things that we're going to end up paying for tomorrow. And then finally, step 3, after identifying and prioritizing, is what do we need to do to make sure that the gap isn't going to grow? We need to make sure that we're growing our asset base responsibly. We need to make sure that we're not continuing to perpetuate our unfunding problem, underfunding of infrastructure problem. And one of the things council could do here is adopt a life cycle costing policy for any new infrastructure. What life cycle costing means is it requires that all funds for ongoing maintenance and replacement of a new asset be allocated at the time the new asset is funded. What we currently do in the city is we look at operations and maintenance, and we look at that funding and say we need to make sure that operations and maintenance is included when a new asset comes online. But we don't look at the major maintenance and other long-term costs that are included with that asset. This is something that asset managers are capable of doing. It's something there's a lot of knowledge out there about, and it's something that council could require as we make these decisions for our bureaus, that they take life cycle costing into account. And then, Mayor, getting back to your point about making sure that we have adequate reserves and replacement, I'll let Jennifer talk a little bit about some of the efforts there.
On Tuesday, April 3rd, I'll be convening an initial meeting to scope out what this general fund maintenance and equipment reserve policy might look like. There will be OMF staff there as well as folks from the bureaus, including fire, that brought this issue to the immediate attention. And I'll point out that OMF already has reserve policy and procedures for the internal service funds, for facilities, fleet, technology, P&D, printing and distribution, that address equipment replacement and major maintenance, which may be a framework that we can start to build on. I expect that, that we can bring this policy back to council by the end of the fiscal year.
So are you've mentioned numerous potential policies. I just want to make sure I understand what it is that are you bringing all of these policies or some of these policies or just that policy? I'm not clear where you're headed with this.
You mean from the prior work session?
No, from
this one?
You have multiple steps here with multiple strategies. Are you planning to bring them back as a package or individually? What is your intention?
So yeah, we are happy to bring them back. Again, what we're trying to get here is a sense from council if this is the direction that they want to go, and to the extent we get that green light, yes, we will develop the policies and bring those back for council.
Okay, my suspicion is you're going to have to meet with the council offices individually and give them time to digest this. I'll certainly want time to digest it as well. There's some great ideas here. I love the life cycle costing policy. I'm curious, are we actually doing that with the Portland building?
The life cycle costs of the O&M are being built into that model, yes.
Very good, because that's Exhibit A in terms of what happens when you don't have a life cycle costing policy. You wake up one day and find out you need to make a $300 million investment.
And I will raise touching on a point that Jennifer just made, that while we have policies on major maintenance reserves, there's a lot of debate about the level that we should be at, what percentage of the entire asset should be in major maintenance reserves. So our discussion needs to include that as well.
And also the enforcement of it. There's one thing about having a policy on the books, but then following that policy and not, quite frankly, weighting the reserves for other uses. So we can write the policy, but then we need to have some commitment to adhere to it.
Rob, did you have a question?
Yeah, just when it comes to the physical infrastructure piece of the condition assessment of assets, I'm wondering, you surely have a lengthy set of criteria that you use to make those assessments, and I just wanted to make sure that resilience of those physical assets, seismic resilience in particular, is one of the things that is considered, because so many of the city's assets were built before there was any knowledge of the condition seismically of the region in which we live. Many of those assets don't reflect any of the current engineering or even engineering at the time because they didn't know. So I would hope that would be included as one of the things you're thinking about when you do that assessment.
Jesus. Any other questions on infrastructure before we move on to PERS? Okay, we'll go on to the next slide then. And I will turn it over to Jennifer.
PERS is a legacy liability, major liability for the city. In 1999, the city issued about $300 million of pension obligation bonds. And the idea was in 1999 to buy down the rate that we were paying to PERS for the unfunded liability that we had at that time. And what I'm going to be talking with you about is a plan for managing the future PERS costs. According to the PERS actuaries, if the actual investment results are near assumption, which currently is 7.2% return on the PERS portfolio, there are forecasted increases in employer rates for the next 2 biennium to allow the plan to gradually recover to 100% funded by 2035. And we would expect to see, if the investment results match the assumption, that the rate of growth of the payroll rates after the 2023 would slow down as new OPSRP employees who have lower benefits will replace the retiring Tier 1, Tier 2 members. And then we would expect to see a significant rate drop after 2035 once a large portion of the current unfunded actuarial liability completes amortizing.
That means we all die off.
I'm sorry?
Meaning all the recipients die off. I like the way you said it better.
Thank you. So the city issued $300 million of pension obligation bonds, as I mentioned. The bonds mature in fiscal year 28-29. And the final year's debt service in that year is $50.1 million. If $50 million were contributed to a side account in 2029, which is the mechanical way that member employers make additional contributions to PERS over and above their normal contribution rates, the projected cumulative reduction in contributions would be on the order of $90 million over a future 18-year period, which is basically saying that if you make an additional contribution today, you can buy down your future contribution rates. PERS offers an online Excel-based tool, which I used to generate the slide in front of you. This slide makes a lot of assumptions, such as investment rates are at the assumed rate of 7.2%. It assumes that $50 million is contributed today and not in 2029, because I can't rejigger the model to accommodate that. But what it is intended to show is that a $50 million one-time investment can bring down the projected contributions that we're obligated to pay, but $50 million is not huge. It doesn't make a huge impact in those bar graphs, but it does show that there is an impact. So with the debt service that is currently in the budget all the way out through 2029, if we were to continue making those $50 million payments into PERS from that prior use of debt service, we could have a significant impact on our payroll rates going forward. So what council could do is give me and the CFO and the CBO direction through a budget note to analyze what it would look like to plan for rededicating that $50 million towards PERS. Josh's, the CBO's budget forecast doesn't go out that far. It goes out for 5 years, so we would have to work to make some projections out beyond that 5-year period. But since the debt service is already budgeted, it might be somewhat painless to continue to dedicate those funds for PERS either on a one-time basis or on an ongoing basis.
Commissioner Saltzman.
Is it considered poor form to consider issuing additional pension obligation bonds before the current ones have come due?
There was significant issuance of pension obligation bonds in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, and it's a gamble on what the return of those proceeds is going to give you relative to the debt cost itself. I think the city was very fortunate, has been very fortunate so far in the performance of those bonds, particularly since half of them were issued on a variable rate, and we were able to ride down the general level of interest rates coming down over the last decade. But I'm not sure I would say poor form, but financially, I wouldn't advise us issuing pension obligations bonds again.
Okay. And then wasn't there a new law passed that sort of encourages cities, counties to do exactly what you're talking about, setting aside a sort of a down payment that would benefit us in future years?
Yes, there was legislation passed in the short session that the governor supported, which facilitates member employers contributing over and above what they are normally billed for to a side account for PERS. There is a special attention given to the school districts and using excess monies to match what the schools are able to provide. The general framework for the governor's bill allows for a 25% match from the state for every dollar that a member employer makes into a side account. The state is still looking for ways to fund that match account, and then the use of that account is it's kind of like the worst funded member gets first dibs at that match. So according to the way that the prioritization works, the city would be lower down because we're not as in bad straits as some other member employers are. But 25% match does get your attention to take a look at it, which is why we started looking at this option going forward. But they have to find the $400 million to capitalize it, and then depending on how many other employers ask for a portion of it, I don't know what would be left for us to consider later on.
Could you tell us about the dynamics here between the 1921 cycle and the 21-23 cycle on one hand, where there's a precipitous jump, and then the 27 to 29 versus the 29 to 31, there's another precipitous jump? What's going on there?
So as best as I can understand this, when we issued pension obligation bonds, we took about $250 million and gave it to PERS to buy down our rates. And those monies have been amortized slowly each year, and the amortization of that will end at the end of the pension obligation bonds. So that would account for the jump between the 27-29 biennium and the 29-31 biennium. And then the decrease after 2035 is reflecting the overall buy down of the UAL at the plan level because of the substitution of Tier 1, Tier 2 employees with a lot of the OPSRP employees.
And what would the current strategy be in the nearer term with regard to the jump between 2019 and 21 and 21-23?
Well, that's already factored into the 18, I'm just counting my years. Yes, it's already factored into the 5-year forecast. So when the budget office prepares the 5-year forecast, we have been assuming that the PERS rates will increase by the full collared amount for the entire period of the forecast.
It's a safe bet. So I think I inferred your answer, but it sounds like you're doing your analysis on the governor's proposed side account incentive, but it doesn't sound like you're particularly hopeful, A, because it's not funded, and B, because we'd be low on the list of priorities. But I still feel like we should do the analysis.
And we'll do the analysis, and a third part of that would be finding the funds to actually contribute over and above what we're already doing, given all the other needs that we previously talked about, such as infrastructure, et cetera. And I'd just like to put on the table that there are other legacy liabilities like Superfund and Columbia Levy, which are not directly reflected in this presentation, but are out there as well. We just don't have the dollar amounts to target to them.
There is that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To the next slide, which is going to be HR Director Summers McGee.
Mayor, Commissioners, thank you for allowing me to come to talk about human resources today, which is a discipline I love very much. So I'm going to walk you through the employer of choice.
Cyrilda, could you state your name for the record?
Oh, I thought, okay. Cyrilda Summers McGee, Bureau of Human Resources Director.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So what you have before you is an outline of the employer of choice buckets of work that we engage in. I'm going to focus on the current work that we're doing to move forward these initiatives and the future work we will be doing with managing staff costs being the focus of how I concentrate my thinking around this. So from strategic creativity, I'm going to focus on effective use of talent. Right now, BHR is receiving bids from NeoGov and SAP to roll out a new performance evaluation system that's online, that's goal-oriented, so that the goal is that so that all employees in the city of Portland understands what success means for them at the start of a year, and then they are gauged and evaluated on whether or not they met those goals. So that is one of the areas where we're trying to effectively use our talent. In the future, what we're trying to do is engage with our partners in innovative solutions to their business challenges. So right now, we have bureaus who are coming to us and they're expressing that they're using a great deal of overtime. So they're coming to HR and they're saying, what are some possible solutions that we can deploy to reduce the amount of overtime that we're using? And we're having a great deal of success making suggestions to them of business challenges that they're up against. In the future, we hope to continue to do that work. Effective leadership, we're focusing here on training our business partners to essentially be able to support managers in administering high-quality, cutting-edge leadership best practices, right? So they're currently located inside each of our bureau ecosystems. When they see something, we want for them to have, whether it's conflict, whether it's disenchantment from staff, how to recognize it when they see it, and then how to disrupt the pattern before it becomes to a place, to a level where there's greater conflict or people are, spreading negativity inside the bureaus. So we're training up our business partners on best practices, ways to acknowledge and disrupt patterns that won't be healthy for business environments. In addition, in the future, what we plan to do is, from an effective leadership standpoint, we also would like to, when it comes to collective bargaining agreements, because I put that into the bucket of effective leadership, to talk about collective bargaining agreements as an aggregate, not as a one-off, right? So that we can understand the implications of one agreement on future agreements in a particular bargaining cycle. And so in the future, we plan to continue to have these more comprehensive discussions with commissioners as well as with our bureau partners as they're beginning the negotiation process. Total rewards. The PTE 17 contract required the city to engage with the unions to evaluate the city's vacation accrual process. And that was our first time really joining forces proactively with our unions to talk about what do they think are best practices, what do we understand as best practices when it comes to vacation accruals, and it worked. We heard their perspective, they heard ours. I think everyone was satisfied with the way the process went forward. And we hope to be able to continue to engage in that kind of relationship with our union partners in the future. So kind of future forecasting, I think that that's a way for us to mitigate many of the conflicts that can come about when we don't join forces with them on the front end. Employee development and learning. I want to focus here on succession planning. Our recruitment team inside BHR has created new dashboards. We are now working with all of our utilities, and ultimately we want to work with every single bureau to come up with collective recruitment and advertising approaches that we think will help consolidate the cost. So right now, each bureau will oftentimes do their own one-off advertisement. Well, we can bundle those. And so those are some of the ways that we are trying to, number one, work with them to succession plan, but also save some costs for the city of Portland. And in the future, we hope to be able to launch a job shadow program, which it feeds into the employee development and learning standpoint. We have many employees throughout the city of Portland who are interested in learning about another department, division, or bureau. And so BHR thinks it's our responsibility to come up with some kind of a mechanism to allow employees to learn about other factions of the city of Portland. And it would be no additional expense to the city, theoretically, right? They would be able to take a bit of time off, shadow someone, and then go back into their daily work. No need to go to a training or a conference or things that oftentimes come with a big ticket or big amount of money. And then the final one is support inclusive work environments. Again, I refer here to our business partners because, and so we are currently training our business partners on culturally responsive human resources best practices. So there are ways to do an investigation that are culturally responsive and culturally inclusive. Historically, we have not had the tools in our tool belt to be able to identify when one of our tactics perhaps isn't the most culturally responsive. So those are some of the ways that BHR is engaging in ensuring that we're an employer of choice and cutting costs when it comes to our personnel expenses. Questions?
So the job shadowing that you were talking about, you're saying employees have interest in what's going on in another bureau?
They do.
Is that in relation to seeking employment in that other bureau? Or
perhaps.
Just,
and sometimes they're just interested in, I wonder what a planner does, or people who have interest in one day having a career in human resources, but right now they're an engineer in water. It's really just an opportunity for people to explore what the other side looks like in a formal way.
Thank you. So this has been a very provocative conversation. Tom?
Can I make one point about follow-up,
Sure.
Mr. Mayor, that I think
You
might
bet.
be helpful? So it seems to me that we have a long list of potential policy changes with financial sustainability implications. Some of them come with trade-offs. I would make the suggestion that this team up here codify some of these in a memo for the commissioners and come up with kind of a follow-up strategy so that we can do the rounds and have some conversations individually with you to see where the direction is on numerous policies, since we put a lot on the table today. Would that make sense for the mayor and the commissioners to do that?
It would make perfect sense, and I was just going to suggest that. So if you and Andrew and Jennifer and Cyrilda could put your heads together and potentially bring some recommendations to the council, I'd appreciate that.
That's great.
Great, thank you. So colleagues, do you want to take a break, or do you want to jump into the next? Okay, we'll take a quick break, and we'll see you all right back here shortly. It's 5 minutes. Human Rights. Thank you for being here.
Ready? Okay. My name is Kofi Desu, Interim Director of the Office of Equity and Human Rights. Mayor Wheeler, Commissioner Fritz, directors, community advisors, it is my honor today to present to you the budget proposal for the Office of Equity and Human Rights. In my presentation, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the work we do, our strategic direction, our priorities, the budget overview, and the budget decisions. I also have two members of the Portland Commission on Disability who will join me to testify. When we talk about equity, whether in corporate or government, we are talking about organizational performance. In the corporate sector, they talk about shareholder equity, which is the financial outcomes that the owners gain from the performance of the organization. In the government sector, equity is the benefit that stakeholders gain from the resources that we administer and the services that we deliver. Equity is about the use of public policies and resources to eliminate disparities and improve outcomes for all. The Office of Equity and Human Rights was created in 2011 and opened in March 2012. And we were mandated by City Council to center our work on race and disabilities issues, and for educational purposes, but also strategic purposes. Educational purposes by providing education and technical assistance to bureaus to cultivate equity mindset, helping them to recognize barriers in our institutions and removing them so that we can improve outcomes for all. We had a strategic direction that was guided by the Portland Plan, which had a framework for equity. And in the framework, the office was asked to create a citywide equity initiative, collect and review city data that reflects on and informs equity work, and create an equity strategy for city bureaus and staff. So by centering race and disability where the deepest disparities exist, we create an institution that works for all Portlanders. The strategic direction that we had included creating a robust, I'm sorry, I'm not, okay. Oh, thank you. I forgot to move the slides. Creating a more robust Title II and the American with Disabilities Act and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act processes. It also includes developing citywide racial equity goals and strategies, and also guiding bureaus through the racial equity plan development process. And in 2015, the City Council made the equity training mandatory for all city employees. So today, we have trained, we can say, about between 85 and 90% of city employees. We know that people go and new people come, so the training continues. Another strategic direction was to enhance the use of a budget equity tool and analysis to guide the allocation of resources. Our priorities include continue to support bureaus with racial equity plan implementation and reporting, data collection and reporting, equity advisors guidance to all bureaus on policies and budgets. Another priority is the strategic plan that the office has to develop. It's overdue. We have promised it for 3 consecutive years without having it in place. So, and I understand the mayor and city council will also provide some strategic directions and priorities to the office. We have also already been in discussion with the mayor's office in how to undertake this strategic planning process. And we would like to make it a robust one. We have the opportunity here to re-engage with the community that supported the creation of the office. Bureau budget overview. In our budget development process, we engage with community through our Bureau Advisory Committee, which is also our Budget Advisory Committee. And the committee members include Portlanders from communities of color, immigrant and refugee communities, senior communities, Portland Commission on Disability, the Human Rights Commission, Portland Public Schools, and a tribal council member from Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Our budget by bureau programs is made of about 23% of administration and support, about 36% of citywide equity initiatives, about 27% of community equity and public participation, and about 14% of civil rights programs. And the civil rights programs include the Title II of the American Disability American with Disability Act and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Now our budget decisions. To be able to meet the 5% cut requirements, we offered to cut the newly hired senior administrative specialist position, but we are grateful to City Budget Office that recommended against cutting that position because of the impact on the different programs that position supports. And the position supports the Human Rights Commission with logistics and other administrative processes, the Portland Commission on Disability on logistics and other administrative tasks, and the Bureau in general as a backup for our executive assistant. Cutting that position will have a significant impact on all these activities. Will take time off from the policy advisors who are really more engaged in equity advice for bureaus. We requested an ad package and the City Budget Office recommended against that. We understand that recommendation. At the same time, we argue that we don't need to wait for a strategic plan to work on meeting the requirements for this Title II and Title VI, which are federal requirements that need to be guided through our office. There is an expectation from bureaus, from our office, to guide them in how to really implement those the policies that are required. And we believe that the need is here. If we wait too long, it's going to continue to impact our performances. It's also going to probably increase the risk for the city for not complying. We are partnering with the city attorney's office and other bureaus in how to develop guidance to bureaus, and also getting ready to provide training for all bureaus, because bureaus has individual responsibilities, but they need a centralized guidance from the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and the expectation is there. Through our equity advisor approach to working with bureaus, we have collected a lot of needs, and those needs include, the expectation from the office to guide them in how to implement, the racial equity plan, the disability, Title II and Title VI, and other equity initiatives. So we believe that funding that position now is going to enhance the capabilities of the office to be able to support the bureaus. So that said, I want to invite Dana, and is Dana still here? She's gone. Okay, she had to leave.
No, this is Philip. Dana unfortunately had a commitment, so I will be speaking in Dana's behalf.
Okay, so Philip, please come forward. And you can use this microphone. Oh, yeah.
I don't need that.
I'm sorry.
Yes, you do, because otherwise the captioners can't hear you. The microphone goes to the captioners, and so you do need to speak into the microphone, please.
Yeah, so the interpreter will use the microphone.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Perfect, thank you. All right, bear with me for just a moment, please. Dana just sent me last minute in an emergency her script for her speech, so I'd like to bring that up first. Oh, thank you. Okay. I have a solution. Please hold, I'm sorry. All right. Hello, my name is Philip J. Wolf. I am on the Portland City Commission on Disability. I am so happy to be here. Thank you for having me today. At this point, I would like to speak on behalf of Dana. So please, like I said, bear with me as I sign from her script here. Thank you so much again for approving the accommodation specialist for BHR and the disability equity specialist of the Office of Equity and Human Rights. 8 months after the position was approved, we have a new disability specialist for OEHR. I would like to introduce you to him, Jonathan Simone, over here to my left. Jonathan is an attorney, and during his previous career, he worked as an intern in Senator Wyden's DC office. He worked on a project to make the Capitol complex more accessible. I asked Jonathan this morning, "Are you the first and only blind person employed at the City of Portland?" And he replied, "To my knowledge, I am." Is that correct, Jonathan?
Yes.
Thank you. So, that means that this is a big stride for the city, and we want to make sure that we thank you again. One important note, Jonathan is currently working on hiring a consultant for us to make our own Portland Commission on Disability meetings fully accessible, which ironically, they are not. I then asked Jonathan, and I'd like to ask him again here, was the hiring process accessible to you? And his answer before was in line with other opinions that I have heard, from BHR itself to other applicants, and that was?
Oh, you want me to say it?
Yeah. Oh, yes, please.
So, in my view, I had to get some assistance with certain parts.
There is a microphone right in front of you, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh.
I'll hold it for you, John.
Oh, so I had to get some assistance with certain parts of the application process. So I think it's really important moving forward that we work on having a standardized web process throughout the city for how websites function for people with all kinds of disabilities.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. The requested ADA specialist in the OEHR budget will help to address the gaps in the city's obligation to comply with the law. You approved the position of OEHR, Program Disability Specialist, last year. Now the Budget Office recommends not only taking away our Senior Administrative Specialist for OEHR, who is primarily responsible for making accommodations for the Bureau and supporting the administrative needs of both PCOD and the HRC, but also wants to wait another year to approve the requested OEHR ADA specialist, accounting for the hiring processes. That could very well be another 2 years of a wait. The city just incurred a $12 million fine for failing to provide accessibility through curb cuts. Should we then risk that kind of cost again with lack of required accessibility to our services? Please support the hiring this year of the OEHR ADA compliance specialist and oppose the elimination of our senior administrative specialist for OEHR. And now the opportunity to respond.
First, I apologize for my mistake with the microphone. I'm so used to looking at you and forgetting that you have a partner who
No worries,
helps.
an innocent mistake.
Thank you. What would this position do more than the current staff? And in particular, I'm wondering about asking for a staff person rather than more funding for things like the web development or various other aspects.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the question. The office needs to develop policy guidance and provide training on disability equity. It means that we have to take a disability equity initiative the way we took the racial equity initiative. And we are far behind. We were, because of the short of staff, we are unable to start the disability equity training that we have been postponing for years. So there is a disability equity initiative, citywide disability equity initiative that we haven't started yet. And we need more support for that.
Thank you. It would be helpful as we move forward if you could give me how this position is different from what the other people who are, or the staff who are already working on the issue, on the disability within the office, what they would be doing.
Yeah, we can provide that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kofi, I had a question that derives from a conversation Philip and I had several weeks ago. And it comes down to accommodation. For example, providing translating services at city-sponsored events. And the question is this: given that virtually every bureau has some degree of community outreach, and given that virtually every bureau has some number of public meetings shouldn't accommodation really be charged off to all bureaus as an overhead issue as opposed to being pushed through your bureau?
Yes, I agree that every bureau should embed, funding in their base budget to address those requirements. So yes, that's what I will recommend also.
Could you help me, and I know I keep imposing on you, you have been very generous with your time and your leadership by stepping into the interim position. And again, I want to publicly thank you for that. But could you work with me to develop a strategy that we could potentially incorporate in the first cut of the budget?
Yes, we can work on that.
Thank you.
Mayor, on that issue, has a request been made to the overhead committee to fund this position?
No, and that should be part of the conversation.
Yeah. Yes.
I see Tom shaking his head over there.
Yeah, I want to clarify that the
Looks like
CBO.
Analyst has something to say too.
I want to clarify the CBO recommends not cutting the administrative specialist position.
And I support that. I think we're talking more about the funding of this and the mechanism for getting this second position funded.
Yes, we will work on that. And in partnership with the CBO, we have been working together very closely to understand, financial implications, but also equity implications. And that collaboration has been very wonderful. I want to acknowledge, the partnership with the CBO this year in this process.
Jane Marie Ford, City Budget Office. To clarify the overhead question, it would be part of the overhead model. They'd receive overhead funding as part of it. It'd be split between overhead and discretionary. So that was included in the request. We didn't recommend it at this time. I think there's a lot of great issues that have been brought up that are discussed in the review as well about the need to provide stronger coordination. And as an audit last year pointed out, this program has likely been significantly under-resourced for quite a few years. The thought was to consider more holistically, what you're talking about now, what's required to ensure that everyone understands their role and responsibility around this work. And the Bureau does have an existing vacant program coordinator position that we recommended could be utilized for this work in the interim if that's a priority in 1819.
Yeah, I would look at the overhead model because perhaps even more than some other functions, the Office of Management and Finance, as was pointed out with the website development needs, with Revenue Bureau, there's a lot of things that the Office of Management and Finance does which also need this expertise, so it would seem appropriate for overhead funding.
I would agree with that.
I have a question. So are you recommending that the budget cut be reduced by 90,000 and also deny the request for ad package?
We are not recommending any cut to the budget.
This is one of those examples of a small bureau that does legally mandated work where the 5% cut just isn't going to work. I mean, so the question really is, how can we be more effective with the resources we have, with the vacancies that are in place? How can we coordinate better with other bureaus? And the director and I have spent a considerable amount of time talking about how does his office, his bureau, work with equity managers that are embedded in the other bureaus. And I think that's still something of an open question, and it's got to be front and center in the strategic planning process that we're envisioning.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
That was exactly what I was going to ask about, which is how many bureaus still don't have equity managers?
Most of them.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's what I'm wondering is like, which I guess is part of the strategic planning process that's going to be undertaken, but yeah.
Thank you. And those who have equity managers, we work closely with them. They even have higher expectations. They express their expectations to us more than others who don't have, because they want us to help them, to support them, because they have the internal work to do, and it's a lot of work. we support the creation of a new position at the Fire and Rescue Bureau because we have been expecting that to happen for some years now, and we appreciate that they are working on that. And there is an expectation to work with our bureau to support the new person who will come on board, but also the bureau in general and how to implement their plans. So.
Question, how many FTEs are dedicated to so-called equity manager on the larger bureaus? I mean, we have 5 or 6 equity managers spread out the city.
Do you know the answer to that, Kofi? How
Could you
many
repeat,
equity
please?
managers?
How many equity managers are there for various larger bureaus? How many are there?
I think it's 7, Jeff.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's 7. 7, out of 24 bureaus. And there are some individuals within the bureaus that don't have equity managers who play that role, but it's very limited. It's very limited. Their roles are very limited.
We actually have that information in a spreadsheet, so we can pass that on as part of the follow-up, so you can see exactly where those FTE are.
I assume that like 110,000 times 7, $800,000 are dedicated to the various individuals focused on equity issues within bureaus?
Yeah, and I think there's actually a few more FTE than that now, but yeah.
All but the police used existing funding and reprioritized to focus on, so that there's somebody whose job it is to focus on equity rather than an add-on.
If I may, Philip here. May I have a few minutes to speak as Philip, other than my speaking before, which was Dana's message?
You're here.
Thank you, thank you. So I just want to say again, I'm Philip J. Wolf, Commissioner with Portland Commission on Disability. I do have personal experience where I've gone to a number of public events where they are sponsored officially under the city, usually under the Portland Bureau of Transportation or other things. One example was the discussion of the highway expansion and traffic reform within the city. When I was looking at the advertising for that, there was a section that said we can provide accommodations, please contact this person, or rather there was not on the paper. There was not a name or a contact phone number. There was no main primary office or no one that could handle it. So when I did end up calling different offices, it became just an unbelievable runaround. That was not helpful because time got closer to the event and time, runs out for working out the accommodations. So I did end up showing to the event anyway and unfortunately missed out on the information, but that's just one of many, many examples that I myself even have personally experienced. And I feel like it's crucial for us to have ADA compliance. The ADA was had a more recent passing of amendments in the 1990s, and we've been functioning with it ever since then. There's really no excuse for non-compliance. A lot of times, for example, waiting for a strategic plan before making a decision like this is using time that we need to be using a lot smarter and making decisions before that strategic plan. So I do want to make sure I kind of wrap it up. In closing, I do want to say that I would love to continue working with everyone here and hoping that you are supporting our need to be heard and our requests as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Philip. We appreciate it. Director, anything more?
I want to conclude that, thank you for showing your leadership, the mayor and the city council in terms of equity. We can say today that the office has contributed significantly to changing the culture of the city of Portland. We hear equity in every presentation, and people have even committed a lot of money in creating equity teams in their bureaus. 6 years ago, Commissioner Salzman, you can testify with me that, that did not exist. So we can say that it's part of the culture of the city of Portland. Now, how to implement it and to show the results, I believe we are making results, but how to show it is the biggest challenge now. That means collecting data, and our office, there is an expectation for our office to help, collect those data to show the progress that we have made. I'm part of many communities, and I can testify that communities are sensing the change in the way the city, works with them. But we don't have the instruments to collect the data to present to everybody that, okay, we have made progress in the last 6 years. So I appreciate the support that you provide, and I look forward to continue working for the city. I'm here, I'm Portlander, I'm not going anywhere. And I'm committed to working for equity.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, and thank you. And Mayor, I just did have a quick addition before we close. I just wanted to sort of zoom out our perspective a little bit, just as a deaf representative for the community. My work, my passion in life is for reform, and things are changing. I would just like all of us to take a moment to imagine what the deaf community is going to look like in Portland in even just 3 years' time, and whether or not we're planning to meet the accommodation needs of that change. That's just one example, I think, as we're envisioning the future that I personally have concerns about that I know will impact us as a city as a whole. So thank you. And thank you for your time today as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. I'm sorry? You may. Come on up. Or why don't we just get a mic to him? Thank you. It'll be easier. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioner Fritz, Commissioner Salzman. I'm Larry Kroll, Commissioner of the Foreign Commission.
Could you hold the mic about 6 inches?
There
you
we go.
That's perfect. Right there.
There we go. I just want to make one maybe suggestion, not changing the culture, but improving and enhancing. It's more than change. Things can be changed, but they really can be improved. That's only my comment.
Good comment. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Very good. Office of Government Relations. Thank you, and thank you. I saw Elizabeth somewhere. I know she's here. There she is.
Elizabeth's nameplate.
Good afternoon, Director Edwards. No.
How
There
about
you
now?
go.
All right. Thank you. Mayor Wheeler, commissioners, members of the Budget Committee, colleagues, I'm Elizabeth Edwards. I'm the Director of the Office of Government Relations, and it's a pleasure to be before you this afternoon to discuss our budget. With me today is Deanna D'Souza, an esteemed member of our Budget Advisory Committee. So I'll give a quick overview of the office, touch on some of the recent work that we've done to help advance the identified priorities of the city, highlight a little bit of the work on the horizon, talk about risks for our bureau, and then move into a discussion of our decision packages. And Deanna will talk about the BAC's perspective, and then we'll close and answer any remaining questions. But I hope you'll feel free to ask questions along the way and that this can be a discussion. So to orient the group, our office is the smallest bureau within the city of Portland. Our core purpose is to centrally coordinate government relations and intergovernmental policy objectives for mayor's office, all city commissioners, the auditor's office, all city bureaus, and Prosper Portland on state, federal, international, and now tribal relations. Our mission is to provide effective representation, strategic advice, and quality service to our clients, and we're committed to equity, both in training, culture, recruitment, and advancement. So You asked us to highlight a few of the ways that our Bureau is working to advance the mayor's identified priorities. And I'll touch on just a couple and give some key examples. On housing and homelessness, during the 2018 state legislative session, which just completed, we successfully passed legislation to refer a constitutional amendment to voters that, if approved, would give local governments the flexibility to leverage general obligation bonds for affordable housing with other sources. We also worked with advocates to triple the document recording fee that will bring in additional dollars in the form of the emergency housing account, in addition to other resources for state funding of housing and grants. We also partnered with the counties to get, and the governor's office to get over $5 million for emergency shelter, and over $2 million of that will come back to Multnomah County. On critical infrastructure, in addition to lobbying at the federal level for things like new starts, small starts that will go toward division bus rapid transit, the last time we met as a group, it was actually in the midst of the 2017 long state legislative session. I am happy to now report that we were able to pass a $5.3 billion transportation package, which will bring in an additional $200 million cumulatively just to the city of Portland in preservation and maintenance money between now and 2025. And that's in addition to earmarks for $1.5 million for Columbia Boulevard, $2 million for Southwest Capitol Highway, and $110 million for Outer Powell. On livability, we hope to champion a bill in this short legislative session that will enable the Department of Transportation and the City of Portland to work better together and coordinate better for the management of and cleanup of encampments on ODOT property. We've also worked at the state and federal level and helped organize with mayors across the West Coast to help address the growing opioid crisis and to direct more funding toward addressing the crisis. On public safety, an example from our international relations program, we're actually working with an exchange of community leaders between the United States and the United Kingdom around preventing violence and building community resiliency through community policing and other initiatives. And on innovation and resilience, our office has consistently advocated for the Urban Area Security Initiative Fund at the federal government that provides funding across the region for disaster preparedness, whether it's a natural disaster or terrorism threats. In another international relations example, we arranged for an information exchange with the mayor of Christchurch, New Zealand, to meet with Mayor Wheeler and talk about what are some best practices, what are some lessons learned on seismic resiliency and emergency preparedness. So that's sort of a snapshot of where we've been, what we've been working on to help advance some of the city's priorities. Looking into the crystal ball for the upcoming year, I anticipate we'll be working on issues around tenant protections, livability issues around auto theft prosecutions, preemption on local gun safety measures, autonomous vehicles, and of course fighting back efforts to curb our local authority. And we'll continue to work on the burgeoning efforts around our new tribal relations program and figure out ways to better engage with the Native community, especially around issues like housing and opioid addiction. In the budget guidance, you asked us to talk about risks. For our Bureau, the success of government relations is contingent upon having excellent staff that have the support and capacity to continue to excel. And so our business is built on human capital. That's what we do. We build strong, trusting relationships. And when, since we're primarily funded through general fund, a cut means people. And a 5% cut for us means a full-time equivalent position, which is then 10% of my workforce. So the risk is really simple and the math is pretty simple, especially looking at the waning economic forecasts on the horizon. That transitions us to our decision packages. We have one cut and one add. Per the direction from the budget office, we identified a 5% cut and we offered up a vacant position, a position that was vacant at the time in our office, which was our international relations associate. We've since hired someone into that spot on a temporary basis to help out with some upcoming international travel and the Rose Festival. Our Director of International Relations wanted to be here to say a few words, but she had a family emergency, so I'll cover her talking points. The International Relations Program at the city facilitates inbound and outbound high-level delegations, manages Portland's sister city program, coordinates with the diplomatic community and local international facing organizations, creates opportunities to promote the city's priorities and engage in best practices, and collaborates with the auditor's office to ensure compliance with protocols and appropriate preservation of international gifts. The associate's role in this program is to provide needed capacity for incoming delegations and acts as the primary point of contact for our 9 sister cities and 1 friendship city. So what that means, fewer visiting delegations supported by the City of Portland means fewer exchanges of information for bureaus and fewer opportunities to promote the city's economic development work. And limiting the capacity of Portland's 9 sister cities and friendship city associations hinders some of their ability. And these are groups that are run by talented, passionate volunteers to put on an incredible array of events and opportunities that help enhance international ties for the Portland metropolitan area through cultural, educational, and economic exchanges. So we're concerned that the program may not be sustainable for one person to do all of the City of Portland's international relations work. Losing the position would also hinder our ability to do some more long-term succession planning, since this is a very specific type of work and train new talent. And if we're able to retain the position, we think that there's an opportunity for the associate to also be of assistance on the tribal relations program and provide some additional support as we grow there. Turning from the cut package to the add package, you may have noticed earlier that when I talked about the scope of our work, I talked about state, federal, international, and tribal relations, and I didn't talk about the region. And that's because we don't centrally coordinate regional relations currently at the City of Portland. And so we've requested an add package for one ongoing position that would be a deputy director with regional relations programmatic responsibilities. This person would be in charge of high-level outreach to surrounding governments and to enhance the city's strategic position. Would also take over some of the managerial and operational duties, thereby freeing up some of my capacity to also engage with the region and work on deeper national collaboration with other cities. I personally observed our need to get upstream and build better regional partnerships, and I've heard anecdotally from colleagues in other bureaus and offices about the need for this resource, and we tested that hypothesis and sent out a survey to offices and bureaus across the city and asked, how are you interacting at the regional level? How's it going? Do you think you need help? As of yesterday, we have 43 respondents. 90% said they frequently coordinated at the regional level. Of those 43 respondents, 60% said, yes, we would benefit from additional help from the Office of Government Relations. So there's clearly a need and a desire for this level of support. It seems to be happening in an uncoordinated way, which can lead to miscommunication or different messages being sent to different players. And that's a role that our office is well versed at playing when it comes to interacting with other governments. With that, I'll turn things over to Deanna to talk about the back's perspective.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler, City Commissioners, and Budget Committee members. For the record, my name is Deanna D'Souza. This is my 3rd year serving on the Office of Government Relations Budget Advisory Committee. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm here to briefly present our BAC's recommendations on the decision package in the requested budget. The committee understood that each bureau was asked to submit a 5% cut package this year, and for the Office of Government Relations, that amounts to just under $82,000. There was consensus among the members that the decision package put forward by the Bureau was sound, while recognizing that the reduction to personnel costs would negatively impact the delivery of service. Elizabeth touched on the impact to the international relations program, and the BAC is interested in the idea of the associate also supporting the new tribal relations program in the position, if the position was able to be retained. During the ad package, regarding the ad package, the budget Advisory Committee supported the addition of a high-level Deputy Director in Regional Relations position to address the operational capacity concerns and further centrally coordinate government relations. This is in keeping with the recent actions around the international and tribal relations. On behalf of the BAC, we appreciate the difficult decision you have ahead of you, and again, appreciate the opportunity to present to you. I'll turn it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, and thanks for serving on the BAC. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Deanna. And that largely concludes my remarks. I want to thank Deanna and all the members of our BAC for volunteering, to Young for his patience and help in putting together our budget, and of course to Office of Government Relations staff for their diligence in this process, and to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Questions? Getting off easy this time.
Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good presentation. Last but certainly not least, here's where all the cuts are going to come. The City Budget Office. I'd say welcome, Director Scott, but walking from that chair to that chair really isn't that big of a deal. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mayor. We will be as quick as we can and maybe even give some people some time back today. I actually like the symbolism because I want to stress that, you know, I've been at the table a lot. We did the earlier presentations. This is the time, though, where I take off that citywide hat and put on my bureau director hat and talk very much about CBO. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows sort of any citywide objectivity goes out the window when during the next 15 minutes. But I'll change that hat back when we continue tomorrow. So I'll be brief. The CBO budget's very straightforward. And I will talk a little bit about our proposed 5% reduction, and I have a couple of decision packages to discuss as well, and then briefly highlight some of the work that we have been doing. So in terms of a quick overview of CBO, we're $2.6 million budget. We have 15 FTE and then 2 Hatfield Fellows, and I've taken advantage of that Hatfield Fellow program. It's helped us supplement our staffing and take on some really exciting new things at a very, very low cost. And I've been glad to see that spread throughout the rest of the city as well. And we've actually had 2 permanent hires come from some of our Hatfield Fellows. So it's been a very fruitful program. I say that as a preface to one of my alternative reductions I'm going to talk about in a minute. What CBO does is, we do the analysis and recommendations that you see before you. We do a lot of it, obviously, during budget season, 200 or 300 pages of it, but we do it throughout the rest of the year as well, during bumps and for special projects that either council or bureaus involve us in. We also do economic forecasting for the city. We do budget development, work with the bureaus on both our operating and capital budgets. And finally, we're in charge of performance management and program evaluation. Our biggest thing I want to talk about today, just in terms of our ongoing projects, is replacing Brass, which is our budget software. We were allocated $1 million in fiscal year 2016-17. We've carried over most of that money. We used a little bit for some system requirement. Contracting, our RFP process is underway and actually almost completed. We did multiple software demos from a number of vendors. I heard from BTS we had a record number of respondents for a technology project, and actually we did notify, and I think I can say it, right? We're beyond the protest period. Yeah.
We've done an intent to award. I don't think we're past the protest period.
Anyway, we've got a contractor and we are finishing up the protest period, and so I will let you know. So very excited though to move forward on that. And over the next year or so, this is going to be obviously my major focus. We're going to be realigning within the office 1 to 2 full-time staff towards this project implementation. Everyone else in the office is going to be pitching in on a part-time basis. It is going to be our highest priority. This is a major project, not just for CBO, but a major project for the city. It's one that I am very determined to keep on track. In my role as city budget director, I've also seen a number of software projects fail over the years. One of the reasons why they fail is an unwillingness to acknowledge when things are off track. So you will not just hear from me when they're going well, you will also hear from me if they are not going well. We are part of the TOC. We do go and update them. We actually pretty aggressively sought their oversight for this project. They were kind of like, well, it's only $1 million. We're not really sure. And we said, no, we really are sure that we would like that oversight. And any other sort of outside evaluation as well. As I've stressed before, and Tom and I have talked, our form of government creates, interesting situations where the budget office gets to implement its own budget software. I am not in any way an IT person, and so I'm relying very much on BTS. I'm relying on the Technology Oversight Committee and other experts to make sure that this is, in fact, that we are on track and we are successful in this. But I think there really is, there's a lot of excitement around this, and some of the things we talked about in the session earlier this morning, when we talk about program evaluation and program reauthorization and financial planning, multi-year financial planning can be built into this new system and actually may already exist. It may not even be off the shelf. And so we're very excited about some of those possibilities as well. And the one thing I will notice, I'll be coming back to council with a contract once we finish negotiations around that. There will likely be an increased out-year cost in the maintenance of the new system compared to brass. And so we'll bring those costs forward to you as well when that comes to council. In terms of our budget request in CBO, the 5% reduction, as Elizabeth noted with the Office of Government Relations, most of CBO's budget is personnel, so there really isn't any place to go for a 5% reduction that besides an analyst position. As I've noted earlier and in prior years, reducing an analyst position does reduce CBO's capacity to do overall budget analysis and special projects. I want to stress that for 18-19, it may be even more difficult to absorb because of the brass replacement project and because of that realignment internally of staff to work on that project. I'm already using some of those analytical resources for the software implementation, which would make it more challenging. As a result, we did propose and in fact recommend an alternative cut, and it's a lower amount, but of $40,000, which would eliminate that Hatfield Fellow position. As I mentioned, I'm hesitant to lose that valuable position, but if savings are needed, this is a better place to take than a full-time analyst in my view. In terms of request, the primary request that I'm putting on the table this year is for a new capital coordinator position. I want to stress this isn't a request for new general fund resources. What instead we're asking for is to realign $150,000 of Build Portland's resources to fund a position that will help coordinate the city's capital budgeting efforts overall. As you heard me say this morning, over the last few years, CBO and the city as a whole have made really substantial progress in terms of how we prioritize and allocate capital dollars. We've allocated $60 million through the capital set aside. We've created criteria that help us rank projects across bureaus based on risk factors and the impact of failure. We've developed a list of funding options to increase capital funding throughout the city for major maintenance and reserves. And we've increased internally our own monitoring of bureau capital budgets. And I've been able to do that by pulling analysts off of other budget work. However, I think if we use some of this Build Portland funding for this position, we can really take this effort to the next level. And when I talked about where we need to go as a city, funding of this position would allow us to achieve a lot of the things that I mentioned in that earlier infrastructure presentation. It would allow us to get better data and work with city bureaus on that data and condition assessment. It would allow us to take our prioritization even beyond the risk assessment that we've been doing towards a business case model. And finally, I think it would allow us to keep the gap from growing even further. I really think Portland has an opportunity right now with this mayor and this council to be an example for other cities that it is possible to make progress on these capital budgets. It's possible to make progress on our infrastructure backlog, even without the federal support that has been integral in the past. Obviously, the federal support would go a long ways, and I'm still hopeful that we may see some of that in the future. But even without that, we have a responsibility to make as much progress as we can, and I think we have an opportunity. Bottom line for this request, it doesn't compete with other general fund requests, but it would require a small reduction in Build Portland spending. And if council wanted to move forward, we could talk about that impact and what it would mean. I personally think the benefit of the position would outweigh any of the costs that we're talking about for that. The second package that we did not recommend, but not because I don't think it's needed, but just in terms of overall general fund availability, this would be to add the citywide survey, restart the citywide survey. This is a survey that's been done for more than 20 years by the auditor's office. The auditor did cut this survey last year as part of her budget, so we are no longer as a city doing this. We're not collecting data on citywide performance and what residents of the city think in terms of how we're doing. The survey measured the public perception of city government. We would really propose to reboot that survey, asking a lot of the same questions so we can continue some of that longitudinal data, but developing new questions as well that could help us understand how the city's doing to meet the needs of the public, and working with the OEHR as well to how making sure we've got questions in there that really get at some of the equity issues that we're facing as a city. As I mentioned, we didn't recommend the $60,000, but I do think it's something worth considering as council moves through the process.
Andrew, a quick question on that. How long can we go without a survey before we lose the trend line and the statistical significance of the data? Are we looking at one more year out before we'd have to redo a whole survey and start over?
I think it's a good question. I think if we asked the questions in the same way, even a couple years later, you could still look back at some of that longitudinal data. One of the other things we really want to look at is how the survey is collected. In the past, it was collected through a mail, sending out mail, and there's some issues there in terms of selection bias. And the auditor was aware of those and addressed them, but there are other tools and techniques in terms of gathering the information we might want to use.
Commissioner Fritz had a question.
Well, on the same lines, I don't know that there is really a trend because of the selection bias. And in your write-up, you say that you don't recommend the package because of the very recent decision by council to accept the cut from the auditor as an indicator of relative priority to other citywide issues. That wasn't why I voted for that cut. It was because I think it's not a representative survey. And so I would favor having some money in certainly as a one-time pilot for a scientific poll, not a survey, and not using the same questions, but something that we could actually rely on with oversampling of underrepresented communities to find out what people actually care about and want. So that would be my hope for having a better gauge of community. I mean, we do polls for all kinds of things. If we want to pass a bond measure, if we want to get re-elected, and I have found those polls, especially on issues, to be surprisingly accurate and sometimes surprising in terms of what people want and what they don't want. So that's the direction that I would suggest we go in.
I appreciate that. And we convened some bureaus just on an informal basis to see if there was interest, and the bureaus that use this data said they really are missing it, but they all sort of echoed what you said, is they think there are different and better ways. So if we were to move forward with a survey again, we would certainly get a work group together, cross-bureau, that really looked at what data we need to collect, the best way to do it, and avoid some of the problems we had. I would suggest actually what you want is politicians who are, as I say, quite adept at working with pollsters to figure that out. And there's professional people who know how to do it and what kinds of questions to ask. So I would certainly encourage, we need to have bureau input into what kinds of data do they want. We also actually need to know what does the community want, whether the bureaus want to know it or not.
So may I see if I may? I believe this project is very important because it provides a performance measure for bureaus. And this is an opportunity because the influence that the city budget office has on bureaus is also another reason I'm recommending, moving forward with this project. So if the city budget office asks for performance measures, bureaus follow that very quickly. So.
I'll just wrap up, and I won't spend time on this slide, but I did want to note some of the other CBO work that's going on. We are engaged in a lot of other things outside of what I mentioned in terms of budget analysis and forecasting and so forth, and I do plan to bring a report back to council in April or May that describes in more detail some of the things we've been doing. This really is part of our overall mission, right, which is to optimize the value of city services. That's why we do budgeting, and that's why we go through this process. And related to that, some of the things we've been doing, international benchmarking of data, helping bureaus doing randomized control trials to see how well their programs are working, the Government Accountability, Transparency, and Results Program, which I think we've seen some really positive results coming from. We've run 2 different cohorts of peak process improvement training in the bureaus. I think almost 40 city employees have been trained through that process to go back and make changes in their bureaus to their processes. And finally, I don't want to forget the Portland Utility Board. The staff person for that is located in CBO, and so we are involved with that process as well. With that, I will take any questions.
Rob?
Well, as a member of the back for the CBO, I just wanted to say that I think that high quality survey poll of the kind that I would expect that office to develop in concert with other bureaus would meet the city's needs, and not having one puts you in a place where you don't have any data related to the kind of questions that you were asking about before. So I would speak in favor of that, taking off my citywide hat, putting on my CBO back member hat. And also, we've talked about the Hatfield Fellow program for years. I think CBO is in recommending the cut in their own bureau to the Hatfield Fellow. I don't know if that's quite a Washington monument, but it does add such value at such a reasonable cost. I'm not really sure I agree with the CBO's analysis that that's a good cut.
How many of our Hatfield Fellows have gone on to work with the city?
I don't know the answer to that. I know 3 of my Hatfield Fellows have gone on, 2 in my office and 1 in the city attorney's office, but we can ask HR because they centrally coordinate the contract.
I'd like to know that, and also the demographics of the people hired.
Yeah, and it's, that's a great question, and it's one, to be really blunt, that the Hatfield program at PSU has worked really hard to diversify. When they started the program, it was not as diverse as I think they wanted it to be, and certainly not as diverse as we wanted it to be. And I've pushed the folks, at PSU, and they are obviously don't need to be pushed. They wanted to do it as well, and I think the last 2 classes have been considerably more diverse. That's really a focus of their program.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Commissioner Saltzman.
Putting back on your CBO hat, I guess I wanted to make a request of you, and I know we've done this in past budgets, taking a look at vacancies in the bureaus. And so I was wondering if we could get like a list by bureau of vacancies that have been in existence for 6 months or longer.
Yes.
And then I guess my related question to that is, what if we just didn't appropriate money for a position that's been vacant 6 months or longer? How would that improve our budget situation? So if you could ponder that and give us
Yeah,
some
we
insights.
can get the data in terms of vacancies and length of time they've been vacant, and then we can do a financial analysis of how much is budgeted for those positions. Yeah,
okay.
That's pretty straightforward.
Thanks.
Good.
Just wanted to add, Commissioner Saltzman, I've asked Director Summers McGee for an analysis like that too, so we'll get it to you.
It's a good ask, Commissioner. Thank you. All right, with that, we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.